All right. Well, why don't we get started? So this is Jack. I think I'm right. This is our last seminar scheduled for this term.
Yep. Yep.
And we will hope to get Karina rescheduled for the spring. And I'm really grateful to Travis LaCroix for stepping in very much last minute on this with a paper I'm really looking forward to hearing if I had a chance to look at. Travis is, most importantly, he's a postdoctoral fellow with us at Schwartz Reisman. He's also a postdoctoral fellow at Mila and University of Montreal in computer science and operations research. His PhD 2020 from Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at UC Irvine with a dissertation, Complex Signals, Reflexivity, Hierarchical Structure, and Modular Composition, discussing a novel process by which language might have evolved via modular composition of communicative structures. So lots of really great stuff to work on. And he is going to talk to us today about the tragedy of the AI commons, and we're looking forward to it. Thanks, Travis.
All right, thanks so much for that introduction, Jillian. Let me just share my screen here. Everybody can see that well, I take it?
We've got it.
Perfect. So I had a bit of an introduction for myself on my title slide, but Jillian has covered that, so we'll just jump right into it. Today I'm going to present some recent work, which is a collaboration between myself and my colleague, Aidan Maseni, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the University of California, Irvine, where I received my PhD as well. He's busy teaching currently, but he should be popping on later in the talk, so I'll be sticking around for the Q&A at least. And you can sort of see maybe in the first sentence of this paper, it's a little bit small, but we begin with something of a truism of sorts. That is, artificial intelligence promises to fundamentally change nearly every facet of our lives for better or worse. So despite the successes and failures of AI research in the prior 7 or so decades, since 2010, AI research is finally starting to make good on this promise, due in part to the success of deep learning bolstered by big data. Now, in response to this reality, there's been a proliferation of policy and guideline proposals for ethical AI research. And these documents are supposed to specify best practices to which researchers, engineers, developers, and so on ought to adhere. So my talk today is about the efficacy of such proposals and the cooperative challenge that underlies responsible and ethical research in the domain of artificial intelligence. Just as a bit of a roadmap, I'm going to spend the first third or so of the talk discussing some background and motivating the approach that we take. And I won't keep you in suspense. We're going to suggest that the proliferation of ethics guidelines for responsible AI research shines a spotlight on the underlying social dilemma that researchers face in this field. So this implies that it's appropriate to understand the cooperative challenges for ensuring safe AI in terms of their underlying social dynamics. Now, in the second part of the talk, I'll present really a simple model of stochastic game dynamics that does just this. And from this, we're going to glean some modest conclusions. I'm not really interested here in providing any particularly profound results. Instead, I'm more interested in illustrating for you the ways in which this approach can be fruitful, although it's quite different from the typical approaches in the literature on safety and ethics. Okay, let's get started. So Jobin and co-authors conducted a scoping review of the existing corpus of documents containing policy and guideline proposals for ethical AI research from a variety of organizations. This review was published in 2019 in Nature, and if you're not familiar with this paper, it really is excellent work. After applying their exclusion criteria to nearly 500 documents that were yielded in their search, they were left with 84 unique documents containing ethics principles and proposals for responsible AI research. So this is the landscape up to about the 23rd of April, 2019, when they sort of put an arbitrary end on their review. And they find that the vast majority, around 88% of these documents, had been released since 2016. So essentially, if we do a little mental maths here, a conservative estimate says that a new proposal has been released on average every 2 weeks for the 3 years prior to their survey. So this is what I mean when I say policies and proposals for ethical AI research have proliferated in recent years. This really has blown up in the last couple of years. And again, this is a conservative estimate. More broadly speaking, the World Economic Forum has identified almost 300 separate efforts to develop ethics principles for artificial intelligence. So what do these principles look like? Well, let's look at a specific example. I'll use the Montreal Declaration throughout this talk just as a concrete sort of thing to present to you. And usually I'll use it to make somewhat critical points, but I don't want you to think that I'm picking on the Montreal Declaration. These points would apply to basically any similar proposal. So for those of you that aren't familiar, those of you maybe outside of Montreal, the Montreal Declaration for the Responsible Development of Artificial Intelligence is an initiative that was launched by the University of Montreal in collaboration with the Fonds de Recherche du Québec at the end of 2018. So according to their website, the Montreal Declaration is a collective endeavor that aims to steer the development of AI to support the common good and guide social change by making recommendations with a strong democratic legitimacy. Now, for a philosopher like myself, this statement sounds very vague. For example, it's not obvious what a common good is. In fact, Ben Green, a PhD candidate in the maths department at Harvard, had a really excellent paper at NeurIPS last year that argues that social good or common good is essentially a meaningless buzzword that gets thrown around in the field of ethical artificial intelligence. And anyone familiar with debates in political philosophy knows this is actually quite difficult to determine what exactly makes a democracy legitimate. So it's really non-trivial to try to unpack statements like this. And again, this sort of language is fairly typical for these kinds of documents. So the process here was that starting in November 2017, a core set of values were proposed, and these formed the basis of a series of deliberations, public consultations, and collaborations that spanned 15 different public spaces, as well as exchanges between hundreds of citizens, experts, and other stakeholders. And the result is the declaration itself, which is based upon 10 principles, which include things like well-being, respect for autonomy, protection of privacy, and so on. And these principles give rise to a set of recommendations that are centered around 8 different areas. For example, the protection of democracy or taking account of one's environmental footprint. So who is this declaration for? Well, in their own words, the Montreal Declaration is addressed to any person, organization, or company that wishes to take part in the responsible development of AI. And here, taking part is cashed out in terms of scientific or technological contribution, development of social projects, elaboration of rules that apply to the responsible development of AI, and so on. They say it's also addressed to political representatives whose citizens expect them to take stock of developing social changes, quickly establish a framework allowing a digital transition that serves the greater good, and anticipate the serious risks presented by AI development. Again, these are their words, so you can do with that what you will. But essentially, the Montreal Declaration, like most such documents, provides a set of abstract normative principles and values that are supposed to promote the fundamental interest of some set of stakeholders. So in this particular case, signatories are invited to commit to the development of AI at the service of the individual and the common good. And again, this sort of language is fairly typical of these kinds of documents. So the principles and recommendations of the Montreal Declaration are quite typical, but Jobin et al.'s content analysis finds 11 sort of overarching principles and values across their 84 different sources. In decreasing order of frequency, these are transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence, responsibility, privacy, beneficence, freedom and autonomy, trust, dignity, sustainability, and solidarity. And Gibbon et al. Do go into some detail about exactly what these terms are supposed to mean. So there is a reasonable amount of variety across these documents and what they prioritize. No single value on this list is common to all of the proposals that they examine, and no proposal contains all of these values. But they do find some convergence here. So transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence, responsibility, and privacy are all mentioned in more than half of the documents. Also, 73 out of 84 of the documents they examine mention transparency. And so you might think, well, look, this is sort of a mess, but at least we're starting to get a clearer picture of what seems to be the most pressing issues in AI safety and ethics in the current day. And maybe we're moving towards something like agreement about what these issues are and which of these issues should be taken the most seriously. This might be true, and really that's all to the good, but let's just get a little bit cynical for a moment here. These proposals, as we've seen with the Montreal Declaration, are couched in broad, high-level, and highly abstract language, which is not always easy to understand in the context of on-the-ground applications, how these are actually relevant or even useful to the average researcher in artificial intelligence or machine learning, for example. Furthermore, although there is some convergence toward a small set of principles, Gibbon and co-authors also highlight that there's significant semantic and conceptual divergence in both how the 11 ethical principles are interpreted and the specific recommendations or areas of concern that are derived from each of these. Furthermore, these documents are all forms of soft law. These are non-legislative policy instruments, which are instruments for cooperation, which are not legally binding. So this stands in contrast to hard law, which consists in legally binding regulations passed by legislatures. And because they depend upon voluntary non-binding agreements between the relevant parties, these proposals really lack the effective mechanisms to enforce their own normative claims. So they're not meant to produce enforceable rules. They're just meant as guides or suggestions for ethical practice. And I know what you're going to say, but wait, don't we know, especially those of us who have read Gillian's work, that law is insular and it's slow to change, whereas technology is rapidly evolving. And so surely something like soft laws are going to be a better way to go than trying to push through legislation that is almost immediately antiquated. And I mean, I agree completely with that. In fact, Yoshua Bengio and I have a project that essentially argues that hard constraints can be less effective than implicit constraints. But it is important to understand that most of these documents, almost a quarter of them, have been produced by private companies. And this is strongly indicative that these stakeholders have a vested interest in shaping policies on AI ethics to fit their own priorities. And other researchers have already noted many of these points. These focus primarily on regulatory hurdles or the actual content of the guidelines. But we want to highlight a different problem, and we want to take a slightly different approach. So the proliferation of these documents, we say, raises pressing questions about their efficacy. It's been suggested that such declarations have essentially no practical effect. And at least one study has found that the effectiveness of ethical codes for influencing the behavior of professionals in the technology field is virtually non-existent. So we propose that a key aspect of the inefficacy of these guidelines comes from the fact that this is fundamentally a cooperation problem. So everybody wants cooperation to happen. Adhering to ethical standards in the development of artificial intelligence is almost certainly a good thing. Everyone would be better off if we all cooperated. But everyone also has an individual incentive not to cooperate. In this case, there are individual costs associated with cooperation. For example, the extra time and financial resources that are required to ensure that research and business practices adhere to the agreed upon norms. As well, there are incentives for non-cooperation. So you might imagine a normative policy that says, don't work on autonomous weapons, to which most everybody agrees. But then if everybody agrees not to work on autonomous weapons, then the one research lab that is willing to work on autonomous weapons now has the opportunity to solicit lucrative Department of Defense contracts, for example. So this is a special kind of a cooperation problem, namely a social dilemma. And the paradigmatic social dilemma is modeled in game theory by the prisoner's dilemma. So if we consider this from player one's point of view, the payoff for defecting when my opponent cooperates is higher than the payoff for cooperating because C is higher than A. Similarly, the payoff for defecting when my opponent defects is also higher than the payoff for cooperating when my opponent defects, since D is greater than B. So defect is a dominant strategy, but from player two's point of view, the situation is exactly the same. Therefore, playing from the point of view of individual rationality, we can expect to end up at the Nash equilibrium, which is both players defect. And this is despite the fact that we would have been better off if we had both cooperated, because A is higher payoff than D. So we model the situation that AI researchers face as a social dilemma, and we use stochastic game dynamics to analyze the circumstances in which we expect cooperation, in this case, adherence to ethics policies, to actually be successful. In contrast to other work in this area, we don't focus on the actual content of the principles, but rather on the social dynamics that underlie the possibility of cooperative success. So I'll present our model now. Essentially, there are three components here. First, we define and motivate the relevant parameters of our model. In addition to the underlying game, the evolutionary game theoretic method that we employ requires some specification of a dynamics. And this is just going to tell us how individuals change their strategies over time, depending on what other individuals are doing. So to get us started, we assume some population of size Z, and this can be thought of as the global AI research community. Each individual in the population can be interpreted as an AI researcher who can individually realize or ignore some proposed norms of research and practice. The population is then organized or divided into groups of size N. So each group can be thought of as an organizational unit. For example, a research laboratory, a university department, a collaborative research group, and so on, which can sustain some shared norms. Each individual has an endowment denoted by B, which is a positive real number. Individuals are classified according to the strategy that they choose to play with respect to the proposed norms for ethical behavior within the community or their group. In particular, they can choose to cooperate by adhering to the proposed norm. In this case, we'll say they're a cooperator. But contributing to a collective cooperative effort imposes some cost to the cooperator. So this is going to consist of a fraction of their endowment. Or they can choose to defect by flouting the proposed norm. And of course, defecting requires no such contribution from their endowment. It's free to defect. And again, the cost may be construed as some additional effort relative to the non-cooperative baseline. So I already mentioned taking extra precautions to ensure that research or business practices adhere to the proposed normative standards. Or we can understand the cost in terms of opportunity costs. For example, refusing lucrative contracts that would violate the proposed norms or standards. Now, we've seen two parameters so far, namely the group size N and the cost for cooperating, which is a fraction of the individual's endowment. Because social thresholds are common to certain cooperative public endeavors, think, for example, of international agreements that require a ratification threshold to take effect. We also add a parameter that denotes the threshold of cooperators in a group that is required for cooperation to actually be successful. So a normative agreement in this case is successful if the fraction of contributors exceeds some threshold, which we denote by P star. So just to make this a bit more concrete, consider if the threshold is minimal, then we only require some individuals to adhere to the guidelines. Even if there's a bit of cooperation, everyone can still benefit. This might be something like minimizing biases in data sets, right? Only a few individuals need to choose to cooperate but everybody benefits from having unbiased data sets. For certain situations, however, the threshold might be maximal so that we really require everybody to cooperate, or else cooperation will be considered a failure. So this might be something like an arms race for autonomous weapons, right? If even one group fails to cooperate and produces autonomous weapons, then in some sense, everybody loses. So if the cooperative threshold is not achieved, then with some probability denoted by R, everyone in the group loses a fraction m of their endowment. And here R can be interpreted as the perceived risk of negative consequences in the event of a failure to cooperate. And m can be understood as the perceived magnitude of those consequences. So consider when m equals 1, the failure to cooperate is perceived to be maximally impactful. Individuals risk losing all of their endowment. M equals 0 represents the situation in which failure to reach an agreement has no perceived consequences. And similarly for perceived risk. And there's an obvious way in which these parameters are going to interact with each other. So we should expect rare but highly impactful consequences for non-cooperation to have the same effect on cooperative endeavors as common but relatively benign consequences. So these are the parameters that we use in our model, and a bit of theoretical motivation for why we think they're the right ones to be considering here. We move on now to the payoffs.
Travis, can we do, there's a couple of questions coming up in the chat, and I thought maybe useful to address now about, Ron, do you want to make your point?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that in fact you do have a set of actors that follow a prisoner's dilemma. I think there are companies that prefer a world where ethics are not followed. If everyone would prefer to defect and everyone else to be constrained, right? That's true. But I actually think there's sectors where companies would rather a world where there's no ethics than a world where everyone follows ethics. So maybe it's just right. Anyway, I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah. So I mean, that's fine. I think that sort of a situation can be accounted for in our model because we're going to have certain individual, as we'll see when we get to the results, we're going to have certain individual research groups that maybe we don't get cooperation getting off the ground, and that would be the sort of bad actors in society that prefer to act unethically. But if we consider the entire sort of research community at large, I think on average, right, you've got academic research institutes and NGOs and governmental organizations and all these different stakeholders who are maybe working on these things. So on average, we can assume that there's something like this. And it's not, right, the prisoner's dilemma is not the specific thing that we're looking at, because in particular, we're looking at evolutionary game dynamics. And so you'll see that the prisoner's dilemma is just one aspect of the game space. In fact, depending on how we tweak the parameters, we can move from a prisoner's dilemma sort of a situation to an anti-coordination game, to a coordination game, to a prisoner's delight. And so we've got this whole range of games, and that's going to be covered by the dynamics.
Thanks.
Jack, you had a comment about the cost. Travis just mentioned the parameters. Did you want to ask about that?
Sure. But it's going to be in the next on this slide once the included is revealed. Right. So that's
all right. So you could jump in if it's not clear yet. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Travis.
All right, thanks so much. Okay, so the payoffs for each strategy are going to determine the game. An individual's payoff is going to depend on what action the individual chooses and what everybody else in the community is doing. And so bear with me, we're going to math it up a little bit. To start, we're going to make use of the Heaviside step function, theta, which takes k as input and outputs 1 if k is at least 0, and outputs 0 if k is negative. So the input for this function, k, is going to be equal to the number of cooperators in the group, this is n sub c, minus the number of cooperators required in order for cooperation to succeed. This is n star. And so just for a bit of completeness with respect to formalism, we can define n star as follows. We already had our threshold parameter p star, which is a fraction that must be surpassed for cooperation to succeed. The critical number of cooperators in a group that are required for cooperation to succeed is n star. This is just going to be the threshold p star multiplied by the number of cooperators in the group n. And since this needs to be an integer, we'll just wrap this in a ceiling function. So to give a concrete example, suppose we have 9 individuals in our group, so n is 9, and we need half of them to cooperate for cooperation to be successful, so p star is 0.5. This means that we need at least 5 individuals to cooperate in order to say that cooperation was successful in this case. So essentially, if we think about it informally, the Heaviside step function, theta, is going to evaluate to 1 when cooperation is successful, and it's going to evaluate to 0 when cooperation fails. And that's literally all it does. So here's how we're going to define our payoffs to cooperators. Let's break this down. First of all, the payoff to cooperators is going to be a function of the number of cooperators in a given group. Second, we already know that there's a cost for cooperation, so we're just going to subtract that right off the bat. That's just the cost times the endowment. Now, if cooperation is successful, then the Heaviside function evaluates to 1, which means that the right-hand summand cancels out, and we're left with just the left-hand summand. So when cooperation is successful, cooperators can expect to receive their endowment minus the cost that they paid to cooperate. Now, in contrast, if cooperation fails, then the Heaviside function evaluates to 0, which means that the left-hand summand cancels out, and we're left with the right-hand side. And the 1 minus rm term just does the intuitive thing that if the perceived risk or magnitude are high, then we lose more than we would have if they were low. So finally, the payoff to defectors is just going to be defined in terms of the payoff to cooperators. The only difference is they don't pay the cost for cooperation, so we just add that cost back into the payoff. Okay, if there are no questions about that, I'll move on to the dynamics. So the dynamics, again, are going to tell us how individuals in the population are going to change their strategies over time. And the specific dynamic that we're going to consider is called the Fermi process. So I won't go into the formalism here, but I will say that at a high level, this dynamic captures the idea that individuals are most likely to adopt strategies that perform better than average. And conversely, they're less likely to adopt strategies that perform worse than average relative to the population. And so we choose this dynamics for the reason that it just has a number of really nice properties. And so in particular, the expected behavior of the Fermi process corresponds to the replicator dynamics, which provides the mean field for a number of other learning dynamics, including the Moran process and simple reinforcement learning. And the Fermi process itself emerges from a number of distinct revision protocols, including pairwise proportional imitation, imitation driven by dissatisfaction, and imitation of success. Okay, so that's the basic structure of our model. I'll move on now to the results of our simulations. So first, I'll describe the parameters that we fix in our model. These are somewhat arbitrary, but we give a bit of motivation for these choices in our paper. So we're going to fix the population size Z equal to 100 individuals. This is the global population. It could have been 1,000, it could have been any number. All that matters is we're going to divide it up into groups. So we chose 100 because that is going to be nicely divisible. We set the endowment B for individuals equal to 1. This is mostly just to keep the maths nice, since costs are going to be proportions of the endowment. So we're just going to multiply by the endowment. And again, scaling this should not affect the qualitative results that we present. And although I didn't actually discuss the parameters of the Fermi process, there is a parameter lambda, which describes the intensity of selection. We're going to set this equal to 5. And again, we discuss why in our paper. There's also a parameter mu for the dynamics, which describes the rate of mutation. This can be interpreted as mutation in a biological context or experimentation, error, or noise in a learning context. And we set this to 0.1. All of the other parameters in our model are going to be variable. And there is a GUI online, which can be found at Aidan's website, where you can actually play with these parameters and see the effects of each of these on the outcome for the model. So these variable parameters are going to be group size, which will range from 1 to 20, the perceived risk of consequences of failing to cooperate, where 0 is no risk whatsoever and 1 is certain risk. The perceived magnitude of the consequences of failing to cooperate, where 0 is no negative impact whatsoever and 1 is maximal negative impact. Perhaps something like the extinction of our species due to uncontrollable value misaligned AGI. The cost that individuals incur is also going to be 0 and 1, again, because this is a proportion of the endowment. And finally, P star is going to be the proportion of cooperators required for cooperation to succeed, which determines the integer number of individuals in the group that need to cooperate in order for cooperation to succeed. Additionally, in a more recent version of our model, we also include a correlation parameter. So this is going to range between -1 and 1. That is the range from complete anti-correlation to no correlation to perfect correlation with individuals. So cooperators, if they're perfectly correlated, are going to be likely to pair with cooperators, something like this. And if they're perfectly anti-correlated, they're going to be likely to pair with individuals who are of an opposing kind to them. So I won't discuss the effects of correlation for our model in this talk, but again, this model is up online and you can play with the parameters yourself. So we compute the average payoff based on the payoffs to individuals that was previously described. This captures the expectation if the entire population Z were randomly paired into groups of size n. We also compute the gradient of selection of the dynamics, which gives us the probable direction of evolution in the short run. It tells us which states of the population are going to be evolutionarily stable and which direction the population is going to tend toward. And you'll notice in this picture on the gradient of selection, the filled in nodes are both evolutionarily stable. We also have a stationary distribution for the dynamics, which is going to capture the long run proportion of time that the process spends at any given state. So even though there are two stable states, perhaps in the gradient of selection, the population is going to spend more time at one or the other. It's more likely to evolve toward one or the other. And that's what the stationary distribution is going to tell us. So as we change the parameters, the gradient of selection may change from selection for an equilibrium where all defect is the unique stable state. And this displays the qualitative dynamics of the prisoner's dilemma. We might move from this to a bistable dynamics with both an all defect equilibrium to the left and a polymorphic equilibrium to the right, where both strategies can stably coexist in the population. To, in rare circumstances, a unique equilibrium of all cooperate, where the qualitative dynamics yields a prisoner's delight. Now, when there is a unique stable state, the stationary distribution reflects that the process spends the majority of time near this state. But when there are multiple stable states, the dynamics may or may not guarantee population level success relative to the demands of the cooperative challenge. In this case, the stationary distribution tells us the proportion of time spent at each state. Hence, although a mixed population of cooperators is technically stable in figure A, the stationary distribution indicates that the stable configuration of all defect is most probable. And we have the opposite as true in B. Again, a mixed population of cooperators is stable, so is a population of all defectors. But we see from the stationary distribution that the stable configuration of a mixture of cooperators and defectors is going to be most likely. So to summarize, there are 4 possible outcomes for our model. All defect is the unique stable state near which the process spends all of its time. Both all defect and a polymorphic state are stable, but the process spends most of its time near the all defect equilibrium. Both all defect and a polymorphic state are stable, but the process spends most of its time near the polymorphic equilibrium. And all cooperate is the unique stable state near which the process spends all its time. Those are the 4 possibilities. So we're interested in the bifurcation point at which the dynamic shifts from selection for an equilibrium where all defect is the unique stable state to an equilibrium that can sustain cooperation. There's some obvious things that we will expect to happen here. So for example, if the cost of cooperation is maximal, then defect will be a dominant strategy since cooperators will have nothing to gain from cooperating. They have to pay their entire endowment if they choose to cooperate. At the other end of the spectrum, if the cost of cooperation is minimal, then cooperate is going to be the dominant strategy unless there's no benefit to cooperation. For example, when R times M equals 0. In this case, the payoffs for both strategies are going to be equivalent. So the intuition is something like, look, if there are costs for cooperating, which prevent individuals from successfully cooperating, then we just need to lower the costs of cooperation as much as possible, and then we'll see cooperation starting to happen. But what we're going to show is that minimizing the cost of cooperation is not going to be sufficient to ensure cooperative success in a range of situations. So we're going to start by fixing the threshold for cooperation at a reasonable 0.5. So we need half of the individuals in the group to cooperate in order for cooperation to be considered a success. And we're going to make the cost for cooperation in this particular set of results as minimal as possible without setting them to 0, because that's going to get us to the trivial situation where it just makes sense to cooperate. So in this case, C is going to be set at 0.01. It's the least that you can put into our model without it being 0. For the first set of results, we're going to look at the interaction effects between the perceived risk R on the x-axis and the perceived magnitude M on the y-axis of the consequences of failing to cooperate. The red area in these graphs corresponds to the situation where all defect is uniquely stable. The blue area corresponds to the previously mentioned polymorphic equilibrium where the dynamics still favors all defect. So essentially, we're looking for what parameter values are going to give us the most green shaded area. This is the polymorphic equilibrium that favors cooperation, and this is the ideal situation. And you will notice that when the group sizes are small, like in the top left, cooperation gets off the ground fairly easily as long as the product of R and M is not too small, in which case there's not really a benefit to cooperating. But that said, as the group size increases, cooperation requires a very high perceived risks and magnitude of consequences of failures to cooperate in order for cooperation to actually succeed. And so the larger the group size, it turns out, the more difficult it is to cooperate. So that gives us some sense of the interaction effects between the parameters R and M for very low cooperation costs. Now, if we look at how R and M together interact with the cooperation cost, we see effectively the same thing. As group size increases, it becomes significantly more difficult for cooperation to get off the ground, even when costs are low. And in our paper, we also examine the effects of how the critical threshold for cooperation interacts with cooperative costs. And we find roughly the same qualitative behavior. The general pattern here is that the smaller the fraction of cooperators required for cooperation, the more likely it is to succeed. And sufficiently demanding cooperative endeavors means that it may become increasingly likely that cooperators can coexist with defectors. But the stationary distribution demonstrates that arriving and remaining at that cooperative state in the polymorphic equilibrium is vanishingly unlikely. Now, in a model like this one, the results that we present should be robust to changes in 2 sets of parameters. First, the parameters of the payoff function, and second, the parameters of the dynamics. So starting with the payoff function, one result demonstrated by the qualitative dynamics is that selective advantage of cooperation is monotonically decreasing in the cost of cooperation and the size of the cooperative groups. A second result is that the selective advantage of cooperation is monotonically increasing in the product of the perceived risk and magnitude of the consequences of failing to successfully cooperate. And these findings hold for the entire parameter space of our game. This is merely suggested by the qualitative dynamics that I've shown here, but in our paper, we actually prove this analytically. And as far as the dynamics goes, in terms of robustness, I didn't delve into the details of the parameters of the Fermi function, lambda and mu, but we discussed this further in our paper. The important thing to note is that the results presented here are indeed robust under any reasonable sensitivity analysis. So moving on, what does this all tell us? Well, a priori, we might have thought that inhibitive costs are the largest obstacle for cooperative success. And indeed, our model provides some empirical evidence for this intuition. So our first moral that we glean from this is the obvious one. It says lowering the cost of cooperation increases the likelihood of cooperative success. That should be relatively uncontroversial. But even though this is fairly intuitive, our model further highlights that the dynamics of cooperation are more subtle than just this. We saw that even for small costs, the dynamics may not guarantee population level success relative to the demands of the cooperative challenge for a wide range of parameter values. Perhaps more surprising is the magnitude of the effect of group size on these outcomes. So this suggests our second moral, that small decentralized groups may benefit sustained cooperation for responsible AI research. Now, in the context of globalization, one might have thought that the best approach for fostering AI ethics and safety was to have just a universal set of principles, a sort of universal declaration of AI principles to which everybody agrees. But our model identifies that cooperation spreads as individuals observe other groups succeeding in their cooperative endeavors. And this is fostered by the existence of many smaller groups where cooperation can more easily get off the ground. Hence, targeting policy agreements at smaller independent groups, such as individual research labs or professional organizations, may constitute a more effective path to the aims of universal adoption of ethical guidelines in the long run. Now, small group sizes may help cooperation in virtue of the relationship between positive correlation between strategies and selection for prosocial behavior. But another way to realize such correlation is via free partner choice. When individuals who are inclined to cooperate in adherence to norms are able to freely join one another in their efforts, this can increase their relative likelihood of success and so spread their example throughout the population. So we get the following corollary. Voluntary participation in AI policy agreements may catalyze the spread of cooperation. Individuals choosing to adhere to a set of principles or not creates positive correlation. So affording individuals the option of choosing their cooperative group may be more beneficial than stipulating that one must be a part of some group. But our model shows that even in small groups, cooperation can fail. So one major factor in this is not taking seriously the risks and the consequences of non-cooperation. Considering the control problem in light of the possibility of artificial general intelligence or intelligence explosion, for example, it's historically not uncommon to just write this off as mere science fiction. But Stuart Russell highlights in his recent book, Human Compatible, that this is sort of like a bus driver driving full tilt toward a cliff edge and saying, don't worry, we're definitely going to run out of gas before we get there. So we have the following. It's important to accurately figure both the risks and the magnitude of consequences for non-cooperation. So note that in our model, the action-relevant parameters are perceived risk and magnitude. So it's essential to accurately figure the actual risks and potential consequences of non-cooperation. That is, if the perceived risk is significantly lower than the actual risk, then cooperation might fail to obtain despite its understated real-world importance. And if we think that failing to cooperate when cooperation matters incurs a greater loss than cooperating when it was not entirely necessary to do so, then there may actually be less harm in overstating the negative consequences of failing to cooperate as opposed to understating them. So one real world suggestion that we might glean from this is that it might be beneficial to further incorporate education on AI ethics and safety across a breadth of educational curricula and public outreach efforts. So the insights thus far have centered primarily on group dynamics, and this says nothing whatsoever about the actual content of the ethics guidelines for AI. Of course, the content of these guides can vary significantly, and that can affect the likelihood that community-wide norms are taken up. For example, if the proposed norms are literally impossible to be instantiated, then they will probably fail to be adopted. So our final moral addresses this. This says that combining many proposals may undermine their prospects for success. This highlights the fact that the likelihood of being willing to adhere to and being able to fulfill a set of policies is going to be bounded by the likelihood of adhering to and fulfilling the conjunction of the policies that that proposal contains. So we show that policies can vary in the magnitude of the cooperative challenge that they present. And the combination of these facts should make us a little bit wary of how demanding we make our policy proposals if initial and sustained adherence is our aim. Instead, something like a piecemeal approach in which agents can sign on to and gain from participation in individual policies might actually provide a better first step on the path toward the ultimate fixation of a robust set of norms for safe and ethical artificial intelligence research. But this is a difficult problem. Even in fields whose norms of self-regulation are relatively well entrenched, such as in medicine or biomedical ethics, guiding principles like this can still be ineffective or at least inefficient in terms of guiding actual practice when there are competing incentives. And this is true even when there's consensus among researchers and practitioners about the guidelines themselves. And it should be apparent that no such consensus yet exists in artificial intelligence. So one final caveat about the results of our model, and a little bit of epistemic humility is warranted here. The target of our model was to address the proliferation of ethics principles, and we explored the conditions under which we would expect them to be more or less likely to garner broad acceptance or adherence. Of course, this model is extremely simplified, right? We don't take it to diagnose any of these challenges in their entirety. Rather, we see it as providing something like tentative hypotheses that then must be combined with further empirical evidence and experimentation to actually inform our judgments adequately. Thank you.
Thanks, Travis. That was great. Very interesting. I will look for hands for questions. Let me just, Jennifer, please.
Thanks, Travis. That was great. I had a question about what constitutes broad acceptance or adherence in your model. And it seems to me like you've got a model which is great for situations in which there's multiple potential cooperators who are all maybe like roughly equal weight. And we're in a situation where the big five tech giants, you know, if we get compliance from them, we're golden, right? And they could have, of course, sort of special motivations for either ethics or the appearance of it. I don't know if you saw the FTC suit in the United States today against Facebook, joined by, I think, 40 state regulators, you know, finally trying to break them up for purchasing Instagram and everything else. But they might, you know, these really, really big players might have kind of a different cost benefit analysis going on. And I'm just curious about how you would think of your model being challenged by those kinds of weightings. Yeah,
that's a great question. Thanks for that. So our model does take the sort of idealized view of AI research globally. That is, you know, we have a bunch of individuals who are doing this research, and there is some sort of equal weighting amongst individuals, and they're broken up into groups of equal size. And so presumably these have equal weight as well, right? So what matters here, right, is not that we have complete cooperation in the global population, or even that we exceed the threshold in the global population. What matters is that we exceed the threshold within an individual group, because that's going to affect the dynamics insofar as, right, the Fermi process says individuals are likely to do what they see as working for other individuals. And so if you look out into the world and you look at other research labs and you see one research lab, they're all cooperating and adhering to these guidelines, and they're doing really well, and they're getting a better payoff than this group that has, you know, a few cooperators, a few defectors, but they're sort of not getting past that threshold, then it benefits you to think, okay, maybe we should also cooperate within our group. And that's how the cooperation spreads, is by looking at what other groups are doing. And so a simple extension of this model to capture the point that you're making would be just to get rid of the homogeneity between the group sizes, right? And to think about, okay, what's going to be the effect if we have, you know, a population of 100 and one of the groups is of size 60 and a bunch of the groups are of size, you know, 5 or something like this, right? And the answer is, I have no idea. I don't know how that would affect the model.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Travis. Jack.
Thanks to, I guess, I've lots of thoughts, but I'm gonna say 2 things. One is your model, as this kind of goes to the point that Professor Bodkin made in the chat during the presentation, that in your payoff function, you have the costs of cooperation or the benefits distributed equally among everyone, and it seems like an assumption that is important to list in your list of caveats. And the other thing, and also on that point, you have the cost of cooperation as a function of the number of people who, I mean, the total social cost of the cooperation is a function of the number of people cooperating, which is not always how these things work.
No, so yes, so the entire payoff is a function of the number of individuals who are cooperating. But the reason why that's a function in that sense is really just to say you get a payoff if you exceed the threshold of the number of cooperators required in order for cooperation to succeed, and you don't get that payoff if you fail to cooperate, right? So it's just it's really the threshold rather than per se the number of cooperators that's doing the work in that function. It's just the number of cooperators is going to tell us whether or not we've exceeded that threshold with respect to our individual group, not with respect to the entire population.
That makes some sense to me. Okay, but my more useful question is this. You're very interested, obviously, in the vagueness of these policy proposals, right? You talked a lot about it in the beginning as motivating this work, but it was weird to me that in your sort of conclusions in your policy proposals, you didn't make a lot of what your model says about vagueness. And I actually think there are things your model says about the vagueness of, there are 2 places in your model that the vagueness of the policy proposals might come in. One is in R and the other is in lambda, right? The certainty with which someone, the probability that someone will switch what they're doing in response to what someone else is doing to follow the cooperative mode will presumably be higher if the cooperative course of action is clear, and lower if they don't know what it even means to switch.
Right.
And then also, if it's clear, the chances the R might be different if a clear policy proposal or ethical guide has more certain benefits. And whatever the vagueness of the benefits is vague for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons it would be vague is not even knowing what the policy quite means. So
Yeah.
it seems to me like you could draw those things out more explicitly and bring your model back to all that vagueness talk in the introduction.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for that. So I will say that this is my co-author and I, Aidan, we have many ideas. This is the first in what will be a series of papers over the course of our long and successful careers as philosophers. So I do take the point, and this was sort of the starting baseline where we wanted to just get a simple model off the ground. And in fact, right, I do front load some of the issues of vagueness in the background motivation. But this is quite a bit after the fact, right? The model that we're looking at really, it has very little to do with the actual content of the guidelines, except for the very final thing that we say. The real motivation is something more like problems surrounding cheap talk with respect to agreements of this sort. So if you're in something like a prisoner's dilemma, right? You and I are playing a prisoner's dilemma, John, and I say, of course I'm going to cooperate. That has literally no effect on my actions because I still have no reason to cooperate, right? And so when, you know, the Montreal Declaration says something like, oh, signatories can sign on and express their commitment to the declaration, my first thought was, okay, what does that actually mean, right? Like I signed the thing and then what? You know, nobody's going to hold anybody accountable if they don't actually adhere to these things. And so the initial motivation was actually not the vagueness of the content of these guidelines, but rather the proliferation of these guides. So it's an embarrassment of riches. Which guides do I sign on to? Combined with the fact that signing on to any individual guide is really sort of an empty promise because these are non-normative or non-binding, voluntary non-binding normative agreements, right? So that was our real motivation, and the ideas about vagueness come up later, but there is definitely a lot of room to explore extensions of models and to dig deeper into the actual content. So your point is well taken.
Okay, thanks. Lisa, are you directly on this point or no? Okay, I'll come back to you. Ron?
Thanks, Travis. I enjoyed the analysis. You know, in thinking about extensions, I think it feels like there's somehow a distinction between the individual researcher and the organization they're in, and maybe teasing that apart could be interesting. But also, you know, given the relatively negative findings about, you know, stably cooperating to achieve good outcomes, it sort of nudges towards, well, you know, surely there's a role for regulation, right? But then I think you have another, you know, so as ideas and things that could be interesting to add in, you know, how do you think about the way, you know, the strategic game of lobbying to affect rules that maybe don't affect you and still have rules that somehow benefit? Of course, that really breaks any kind of assumption of parity, right? Like that game is all about basically trying to lock in a defecting strategy into the law. But it would be really interesting to see extensions that started to talk about how these sort of laws, you know, would play out.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So one thing I did mention that, of course, the big tech companies have proposed their own ethics guidelines. And the reason for this is presumably because they have a vested interest in saying these are the guidelines, right? These are the ones that we want to follow or something like this. And then, of course, this does create this sort of feedback loop where if there are no specific regulations in place, there's no actual legislation, there's no hard laws, then if we go on something like a case-by-case basis, and we find ourselves in a court or case law or something, judges are not experts with respect to artificial intelligence. And so what are they going to do? They're going to call upon the experts to testify about such and such. And those experts are going to be the individuals who are from these companies that have these vested interests and so on. And so there definitely is something of a feedback loop there that does definitely play into this in the more realistic considerations about what's actually going on in the world. That being said, I feel like there was something else I wanted to say about that came to mind. Maybe it'll come back to me, but yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Travis. Brian.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks. So you commented, and I think critically, I mean, you were critical of the framing of a lot of these guidelines in abstract, highfalutin normative language and so on and so forth at the beginning, because it wasn't clear what concretely they amount to. But my sense is that partly one reason that they get framed that way is that the point is not to actually construct a well-defined technical model such that people can maximize their own benefits, but to sort of, you know, call on our better angels and, you know, call a kind of higher normative standard such that it's not just about maximizing benefit and anything like this. And, you know, I think there's good argument that in fact, if you don't have any ability to call on the better nature of everyone and everyone is actually maximizing benefits, you know, we're all probably lost just in general. And I think even some things like the protests of Google employees with respect to various kinds of things, I mean, Defense Department contracts and Timnit and so on and so forth, I don't think that's empty, that we need actually a kind of shared normative standard, which is not about individual benefit. And, you know, you can model selflessness by saying, well, look, the reason you're selfless is actually because you want to be selfless. And so you're maximizing your own self, you know, whatever. And Sartre wrote about this and God knows and so on and so forth. But I'm not much sympathetic to casting selflessness or collective behavior or the collective intentional communities in history of, you know, the United States in terms of individual benefit of being selfless. I don't think that's a very deep way to get at selflessness. So I'm just concerned about that, the whole presupposition that a cost benefit analysis can actually get at what matters in this. I mean, the model is very elegant. I don't mean to deny that, but I do worry that it doesn't get at what the fundamental issues that are actually at stake here.
Right.
And other small things like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's certainly true. The basic sort of starting point for this again is to kind of take a step back, right? So you mentioned an issue that I took with some of these guidelines. But the thing is that those sorts of things that are pointed out, some of the issues that I took with like the vagueness of the language, the inapplicability for researchers on the ground to apply these concepts and things like this, these are all the types of things that other individuals have pointed out about these guidelines, what makes them, you know, ineffective or things like this, because a lot of people have written about the inefficacy of these guidelines, but specifically targeting either the content of the guidelines or the fact that they don't have any way to sort of enforce their own normative standards, right? And so the sort of motivation for this project was to take a step back from that and think about like, okay, well, suppose we want, you know, regardless of what's actually in the guidelines, suppose we want to try to ensure cooperation. How possibly could we do this? And some things obviously come to mind, which are captured by our model, like, you know, if there is a cost for cooperating, if you accept that assumption that it's going to cost you something to cooperate, then maybe if we lower the costs of cooperation, then we can get more widespread cooperation regardless of the actual content of the principles that we're agreeing upon. And to some extent, right, it's a little bit unfair to, of me, I mean, to sort of attack these things for being vague, because this is really a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, the extent to which these sorts of policy proposals are going to be useful to actual AI researchers, because these proposals are typically, put together by these huge interdisciplinary committees or ad hoc expert groups or things like this. There's social scientists and ethicists and philosophers and computer scientists and government and lawyers and all sorts of people coming up with these sorts of these guidelines at some sort of a high level. When you're a PhD researcher in the lab at Mila working on your code, and you're worried about making sure that your research is adhering to some sort of responsible guidelines, the problem with the abstractness and the vagueness is going to be that it's not clear how that actually ends up applying to the code that you're writing on your computer. But on the other hand, right, because technology is so quickly moving, vagueness can also be a virtue here, right? Because the thing is, if we just sort of gesture toward a kind of principle that we want, then we leave room for how in particular it's going to be instantiated, right? So if we're very, very specific about how to instantiate these principles, it might be the case that in 10 years, the principles end up being completely antiquated, in the same way that if we have very, very specific laws that are targeting specific practices or something like this, right? So, vagueness is going to be both a plus and a minus, but really we're interested in this paper just on the sort of exogenous factors that may or may not promote cooperative cooperation within these groups. And so that's, again, it's a small piece of a larger puzzle that we have in mind.
Okay, thank you, Travis. Lisa.
Hi, Travis. This was super interesting. My question isn't so much about the details of your paper and your model, which was fascinating, but kind of the broader question around AI ethics and getting agreement around principles and what they mean and people to buy into it. So I was struck by just, when you're characterizing law, and I know this wasn't your focus, just as, formal rules, and the issue there that's helpful is enforcement. But one of the other things that law does is plays a kind of coordinating function. So what I mean by that, like if you think of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there's a vague set of principles, right, that are highly contested and contestable. And so how do we fill that in? We fill that in through people bringing cases saying, I think this is what it means in this case, and I think you violated it. And we have a whole set of procedures as to how you do that, who gets in, who gets to say that, and then we make decisions in those concrete cases, and we build case law around that. And it starts to create the concrete meanings of what those general principles mean. And so law plays I call coordinating function, and there's lots of ways in which law plays lots of different kinds of coordinating functions, but that's one of them. And so it's not just enforcement, it is that filling in. But there's other ways in which things can get filled in short of kind of this sort of more laissez-faire cooperative model. And I'm just kind of wondering I don't do AI research on, let alone the ethics question. So maybe this is just for everyone, but if you're doing research generally and you're doing human subject research, you have to get ethics board approval. And that's a condition of moving forward with your project, both in terms of university rules and funding rules. And that's an area that my colleagues would call soft law. And there's a lot of sort of ethical deliberation that goes in that context. And I wonder if that's a mechanism that in the AI community you can think more about how to use that to coordinate kind of a little more convergence, maybe on the principles, but also on the the more this case law function, like how do we work this out in concrete detail in a ways that isn't the full, law is not ready to regulate AI apart from some very sort of baby steps, I think, but but to build that out in a way. And then that raises a lot of questions I know Jillian has too about research that's done in the context of like the Facebook researchers or the Google researchers, to use a like explosive current issue, versus, you know, university researchers and the role in which that might play in that context. But I just wonder if there's something in between that sort of, you know, here we all are trying to cooperate versus law kind of coming in and regulating. And there's lots of bad things to say about research ethics boards. I'm not saying use the existing research ethics board model. You know, I have some colleagues who've done some interesting work on that, but maybe there's a version of this that the AI community could kind of create.
Yeah, thank you. So I agree entirely with essentially everything that you say. And notice that some of the suggestions that we glean from our model are actually entirely consistent with that sort of idea, right? So we don't instantiate it particularly, but this is sort of a gesture in that direction, right? If you consider ethics approvals concerning research with human subjects, the way that that works pertains to the claims that we make about decentralization and promoting cooperation within smaller groups, right? Because it's an individual university or, you know, a department or a faculty or something like this, where those individual conventions or rules or regulations within that community are going to apply, right? So even though they might be consistent, somewhat consistent, the contents might be somewhat consistent across universities, you're going to find some sort of a variation in the process, right? And this seems to be the sort of a sort of particular instance of the type of thing that we're gesturing toward, where when you have those individual groups, you are more likely to get more cooperation for these other reasons, right? And so it's entirely true that, again, the content and the mechanisms by which these things are going to be enforced are going to have a significant effect. But the idea of having something like individual groups in a particular faculty, particular university, particular research lab that have to adhere to some normative conventions, that's entirely consistent with the idea, right? It would be, you know, the salient distinction would be something like if the APA, the psychological APA, not the philosophical APA, if they just like had a statement about what is considered responsible or ethical concerning human research and expected, you know, globally individuals who are members of the APA to adhere to those guidelines. There's probably reason to think that that maybe isn't going to work, but it obviously works, you know, for all of its flaws. It obviously works to some extent within these individual communities. And so that's exactly right. And then there's going to be these other things, as you say, that that are going to end up playing into it. We're just looking at the underlying dynamics and sort of bracketing those other things that might play into the situation for now.
Super, thanks. Julian.
Thanks, Travis, for the paper and for everything. I'm just reading the paper. I haven't read it yet. I will definitely. I see the title is The Trial of the AI Commons, and I was wondering, are there any AI commons? That's my first question for you. And the second one, just quickly, like listening to you describing your conclusion, and also seeing the abstract, seeing that as you're saying here, the coordination for a common good should be attempted in small groups in which the cost of cooperation is low and the perceived risk of failure is high, which reminds me a lot, as I see in the chat, Elinor Ostrom's research, especially with the fisheries in Turkey, for example. So in the world of AI, the world of scalability and all these big models, how do you think it could be applied, or any examples where that could be the case? Thank you.
So as far as I might have to get you to repeat the second question after I've answered the first question, because that's how my brain works. But in response to the simple question, what do we mean by an AI commons? Well, some of the sort of before we started delving into the research and actually building up the model, what we had in mind was something like tragedy of the commons from game theory. And so this is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek title. The full title for the more philosophical version of the paper that we're working on that actually talks about the problems of cheap talk is going to be something like Cheap Talk Declarations and the Tragedy of the AI Commons. So it's just supposed to be suggestive and a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But the way that we were initially thinking about this is that this really, as far as social dilemmas go, I mean, you could characterize this maybe as a prisoner's dilemma. Maybe you don't want to characterize it as a prisoner's dilemma because maybe it's more like a stag hunt. Maybe it's more like, something else. It's probably not a prisoner's delight. But the tragedy of the commons seems relevant here in the sense that you could consider the global AI community as the commons insofar as, despite the fact that there is very, very, very low probability that there's some individual not affiliated whatsoever with any research lab or any research team or something like this, that is just sitting at home on their computer and has some GPUs and cooks up an AGI or something like this, right? Super unlikely, obviously, but theoretically possible. And so this is going to be different than, say, something that you might take to be an analogous sort of social dilemma, that is nuclear disarmament, right? This really requires like big groups. I mean, we're talking about countries. We're not really too worried about individuals sitting at home and building up a stock of nuclear warheads or something like this, right? So artificial intelligence research is sort of different from other kinds of social dilemmas in the sense that there is kind of this possibility for individuals, right, to actually have some sort of an effect on the outcomes, the possible negative outcomes of unethical AI research, right? And so this is what we sort of mean by the commons in that sense. So sorry, can you repeat the second part of your question?
Sure, and just to follow up with the first one, maybe benchmark data sets can be considered commons as everyone uses like ImageNet and all of those, maybe, I don't know. So the second one, so you said the coordination for a common good should be attempted in smaller groups. Do you have any examples of like concrete empirical examples, or have you heard of anything where that could be the case? Just to make an idea, like how to think about it. Yeah.
So I mean, something that is the sort of the opposite of what we mean is that last summer, UNESCO started putting together their own version of a policy and guidelines, and they've been soliciting feedback from various citizens across the world and so on. And so this is supposed to be one of these documents that is ratified by countries all across the world, any sort of member states of the United Nations, and so on. And so this is really like a global effort. Something that might be more productive than that is targeting individual smaller groups such as the ACM, which is an association, has their own guidelines in place, and they actually have some sort of enforcement mechanisms in place to have individuals adhere to those guidelines. And so the idea is something like, look, there might be a cost for cooperating, but we're also, right, having something like an academic membership to an academic body, having something like that be the standard for proposing guidelines actually imports some sort of a cost for refusing to cooperate as well, in the following sense, right? If you are going to refuse to cooperate, then you're not going to be a member of our academic body, right? And if you're not a member of our academic body, then you're not going to get all of the benefits that come with membership, whatever those might be. I mean, a lot of conferences in philosophy, for example, require you to be a member in order to go to the conferences and so on. And so now there's a cost for failing to cooperate, because if you defect, you just can't even enter the game in some sense, right? So now suppose you decide to cooperate and you get your ACM membership. Now you're a part of that group and you're cooperating. If you, as an individual researcher or as a part of a lab, violate the conventions that have been laid out that are conditional, that membership is conditional upon, then they actually have some sort of punishment mechanisms in place. And this is something I was looking into last year, and it was a fairly new thing that they had put forward. So I have yet to go back and see how successful this has been, but punishment is something like, you know, we revoke your membership for a year or something like that, or, you know, whatever else. And they have specific bodies set in place to actually review whether or not such and such guidelines have been violated or not, and so on. And so you can see the extent to which, you know, I mean, even a academic body like the ACM is relatively large, right? It's not like a small research lab at a university or something like this. It's relatively large, but it's much, much smaller than something like the United Nations or some sort of a global context, right? And you can see the ways in which those incentive structures can be put in place. And that's going to change the dynamics, right? Because you're playing with the cost for cooperating versus the cost for defecting by introducing new incentive structures. So that's an example of this sort of thing. And if other associations see that actually this is quite successful, that's the way our model suggests cooperation will spread, is if you see actually this plan being put in place is really successful for getting cooperative behavior off the ground. So we're also going to implement something like this.
Great, thanks. There's very lively exchange in the chat about Google's transparent or not, lack of transparency, I think, in relation to what happened to Timnit Gebru. And I'm wondering if anybody wants to contribute any comments there, because I think that's when Lisa's talking about, you know, the way legal process work, a key thing is all that it's public process. Right, so you announce a set of commitments you're going to make as a country or whatever, and then you have a public process and forcing out information, right? So you know, being able to say, look, I want to see the reviews, I want to see what opinions, who gave those opinions, on what basis, etc. That's a critical part about how we, and because I think your model is emphasizing how you support the cooperation, is you have to have observability. I actually think this is, I do share Lisa's view that it's the observability there that's really important. But I wondered if anybody wanted to, Travis, you want to jump in, Sheila? Go ahead.
I was just going to say to your last remark, this is a great community to ask this question of, because I'm curious, part of that request for transparency involved naming names. And you know, we don't do that at the university, which we are holding up to a high standard in cases of tenure reviews or various other things. I'm curious just what people think about whether it is appropriate to ask to name names in the name of transparency.
Well, is the I was following this when it was first announced, because I have a lot of computer scientists on my Twitter feed at Mila, and that was basically all when this was announced that anyone was talking about. But I sort of haven't looked at it in the last couple of days because I've been busy preparing this talk. But so the calls for naming names, is that a call for individuals to name names publicly or within the context of Google, so that there's some oversight within the company as opposed to, say, like publicly, globally naming names, right? Because those are two different things.
Yeah, I guess so. So maybe I'll just say a couple of things. I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not arguing one side or another. And I was actually just curious about academics' opinions on that very narrow issue. And it's not, Travis, I don't expect you to necessarily know the answer or have an answer, but my understanding, I don't know whether it was to be conveyed publicly or just to the aggrieved person. But in both cases, I draw the analogy with tenure, where I know there's a committee, but I don't know how people voted and who it was that decided that they didn't want to give me tenure, or and so I guess I draw that analogy, and I'm just curious about what people's sensibilities are. These are all tough issues, and I'm just, you know, transparency sounds great, but it has its boundaries, like all things, and I was just curious about people's opinions about that, because it does seem to contradict what we do in academia, which we hold in high regard in so many other cases. So for you or for anybody else.
I'm happy to jump in, but I also wanted to see if anybody wants to speak to that. I mean, I think that we actually have a lot of we have a lot of layered versions of so when we have, I mean, I actually don't know how it works at U of T, but you know, the American universities I've been at, when you did have like votes on tenure, you know, you have some places it's a public vote, you have some place it's a secret ballot. Certainly if there's any, I think the point is if there's a challenge to whether or not, let's say, norms, rules of some kind have been violated, then we work our way up to a transparency, so that ultimately if you file, the key thing you get when you file a lawsuit is you get a right to say you can't, you share this information. So even when we say we'll keep your name confidential as a reviewer for a file, if there was a challenge that the tenure decision was infected with inappropriate considerations, or if it violated the rules, it violated at some level the norms, which is I think part of, you know, saying you've announced all these, you know, you say you're responding, you've done it on this ground, but your rules aren't being followed, you don't require these things. That's exactly the context in which we do start to say the key thing you get with a lawsuit is you get the capacity. People always say you get your day in court, you get to speak. I say you get to hear. You get the capacity to say, I'm calling you to account. I get discovery of the documents. I get discovery. None of those letters are in fact confidential in a tenure process if there is a lawsuit that's filed. So I do think that, and I think that's a critical point is about what happens as we move further and further. And within the university, right? If there are challenges that go up, if there's grievances, there's a different set of standards there.
Are the letters anonymized, and are the when they're provided, and are the votes of the committee?
Not necessarily. If you go up to, no, I think if you get, because yeah, so I think you are, I mean, you know, at the court you may keep things confidential on a protective order, but you have tensions with public courts. Rhonda, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with, you know, it's funny that I think Ron had mentioned the AI principles at Google, and they're only 6, but of the 6, there are 2 that stand out on this issue. The number 2 is avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. And I think, you know, we're seeing cases here, and someone rightly pointed out in Microsoft as well. And, you know, anywhere where when we look at these sort of principles, we can see where when you call something like unfair bias out, there's always a backlash, even if it's part of your principles. And the number 6 in Google's list is, actually number 4 is be accountable to people, right? And so they talk about accountability explicitly as a principle. So, you know, I appreciate the kind of conversation where we have to balance this, right? So being accountable on the one hand, and yet talking about transparency and what that will or will not do. I think we actually, at some point, you have to take a stand. And if it is one of your principles, then I think you know where you should be standing on this, right? I mean, there are organizational goals here that have to be satisfied. And the cases are always more complex than they are presented to us. But, you know, speaking to some of the people on the inside, I think there's a process and procedure. And if it is part of your value set, then, and you've made it explicit in your principles on AI, then you've got to stand with that.
Yep. Agreed. Okay, we are at time. Thank you, Travis, for a great presentation and stimulating this great talk. And thanks everybody for being here. And I think we enjoy your holidays. We will see you in various ways now in the new year. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Jillian.